issues in the American elections? Well, apart from personality, which is obviously central, there are two main issues. One is management of the virus of COVID, and the other is management of the economy. Those are really the big issues. If it was not for COVID, I think we would see a different kind of race. President Trump was ahead, and now he's about 8 or 9% behind in the national polls. So it's clear that those issues are the ones which have swung public opinion in general. What is largely irrelevant to the election is actually foreign policy. And that means that for most Americans in the most important and most influential places, foreign policy is not a key issue. It is for a few people, but not enough to make it decisive. And that's the first thing. So let's have a look at what the state of play is as we go with a week to go into the election. So if we look at the national polls, then we see, like I said, that the challenger, Joe Biden, is about 8 or 9 points ahead nationally. But that, because of the American political system, for those of you who are not from America, doesn't mean very much because of the Electoral College, which means that you have to win a majority in each state separately, and that larger states have more electors, so they're worth more. So if we look at those states that are in play, which are sometimes called swing states, then if we look at the polling there, we also see that in nearly all of them, Joe Biden is ahead, and it ranges from Michigan, where he's about 7.5 points ahead, to Florida, where it's less than 2%. And in Ohio, Trump's ahead by less than 2%. But we shouldn't take any of those figures too seriously. Why? Well, first of all, even the best polls have a margin of error of 4%. So that's the first thing. But there are two other reasons why polls can't tell us that much about the election. The first is because a lot of the election will depend on what percentage of voters will turn out, right? So in the last election, the Black community turned out less to vote than they did for President Obama, less for Hillary Clinton than for President Obama. And those marginal changes, right, even though the majority of them voted for Clinton, those marginal changes had a big effect on the overall result. And we don't really know, particularly with COVID, how many people are going to turn out. It's much more difficult to calculate. The second reason why it's very difficult to know what the result will be is because of voter suppression. And that means attempts to prevent people voting. So in 1965, as part of the civil rights legislation, an act was passed called the Voting Rights Act. And that made it illegal for states to have all sorts of tricks to prevent people from voting. So after the Second World War, although formally 100% of Black Americans had a vote, actually only 20% managed to be registered in a way that enabled them to vote. Now, that legislation was basically ruled effectively unconstitutional in 2013. And since then, more than half the states of the Union have enacted legislation to make it more difficult to vote. Okay? So there has been an increase of 40% in the amount of people whose names have been removed from the electoral register if we compare before 2013 to after 2013. There's also been a decrease in the number of places where one can vote, and that's why you see very long queues. And one of the scandals is that a company in Britain in 2016 called Cambridge Analytica helped the Trump campaign to target certain areas and certain voters using what's called big data, the masses of amounts of information, to try and focus the efforts in those areas. So even if Biden is ahead in the way that the polls suggest, first of all, they may be inaccurate. Second of all, people may not actually vote who say they're going to go and vote. And third of all, some of those votes, probably more than ever, there will be an attempt to rule them out of bounds, to rule them as not counting. And that's particularly to do with the postal vote, right? So, very small things like an apostrophe in the wrong place can be enough to discount a vote. And then we may not know the results of the election, for a little bit, not because both sides may well legally challenge the results. Left, right, center, Democrat, Republican. It looks like there's going to be a lot of reasons to challenge the results. So we could see chaos, we could see even violence. But the bottom line is that in America, the armed forces and the police swear allegiance to the Constitution, not to any person, be it the president or the challenger or this party or that party. So order will eventually return. We're not going to see a rerun of the Civil War, but it could, if it's close and if it's very controversial, it could get messier than anything that we've seen in any of our lifetimes. So that's the first part of what I wanted to say. The second part is to do with what's the role of American Jews in this election. So the first thing is, for about 100 years, American Jews, the majority of them, have voted Democrat and they identify with the Democrats. And if we look at the last 4 or 5 elections, then we're looking at estimates of the Jewish vote being somewhere between 70 and 80% for the Democrats and somewhere between 20 and 30% for the Republicans. Generally, it's more like 20, 25 for the Republicans, 70, 75 for the Democrats, and then sometimes a third candidate will pick off some of the other ones. And that's what the polls are telling us now for American Jews. There is one subset of American Jews that vote the opposite of the rest of American Jews, and that's Orthodox Jews. Orthodox American Jews are 75% for Trump. So they are like a reverse of the rest of the Jewish community. Now, why do American Jews vote Democrat, and why isn't that changing? Particularly Israelis wonder, given that, if you were to, when you poll Israelis, 2/3 of Israelis prefer Trump and 20% prefer Biden. So what's going on here? So the first thing to say is that of all ethnic groups in America or religious groups in America, American Jews are the most liberal, with a small L, right? Liberal. So the Democrats are a lot more liberal than the Republicans, and that has become more so in the last 50 years. So that is one major reason why Jews tend to the Democrats. One of the other reasons, which is connected, is in the last 40 years or so, the largest voting bloc for Republicans has become evangelicals. And evangelicals challenge the separation of church and state in the US. And American Jews find that threatening. They see separation of church and state as something which guarantees their rights and which is fundamental to their freedoms. Now, if you're a British Jew, you find that odd because, Britain doesn't have a full separation of religion and state, and yet British Jews don't feel that there's about to be, an inquisition. But without getting into the details, American Jews genuinely feel that way. And as the evangelicals from the 1960s onwards switched from being Democrats to being Republicans, so less Jews have voted Republican, and they've become even more firmly ensconced in the Democrat camp. Now, given that American Jews are less than 2% of the American population, why are we even talking about them as significant in this election? Well, we're talking about them as significant because their turnout is almost double the average. So the average turnout in American presidential election is sort of around 55%. American Jews tend to vote at nearly 90%. So first of all, you can double the number, right? The second thing to recognize is that in some of these swing states, there's a higher percentage of Jews that live in those states. So if we take Florida, which is one of the closest, and Pennsylvania, which has one of the most electoral college votes. So there we're talking about Jewish populations of probably closer to 4%, which means, let's say, 7% of the vote. Now, given that the gap between the candidates is probably, a 2, 3, 4%, something like that. So American Jewry suddenly takes on importance, okay? So if you could swing a third of American Jewry, right? If you could swing a third of them one way or the other, then that actually might make a difference. So let's have a look at American Jewish attitudes in those states. Well, it turns out that those states are really, at least from the polling that I have access to, behave pretty much like American Jews throughout America. So that is 75-25 to Biden, okay, in Florida and in Pennsylvania. Those polls are not going to be as accurate as the national polls because they're smaller. They ask less people and they ask less regularly. But that's what we've got, and it fits with the general picture. Now, given that most American Jews, when asked, will say that Israel is important or even very important to their American Jewish identity, you might say, well, if that's the case, and most Israelis think Trump's better for Israel, why aren't more American Jews supportive of Trump? Well, we've already said why they support the Democrats. So let's have a look about how they think about Israel electorally. Well, let's say 25% of Americans are going to support Trump. But if you ask them who's better for Israel, Trump or Biden, then we get to about 45-55 or 40-60 in Biden's favor. In other words, there's 15 to 20% of American Jews who recognize, who are willing to admit, that they are not going to vote, even though they care about Israel, they're not going to vote for who they think's best. So how does Israel fit then for those American Jews? It works like this. Israel's what we'd call a threshold issue for American Jews. Most of the time, American Jews vote like other Americans on other issues, the economy, COVID, ideologically, whatever. If a candidate falls below the pro-Israel threshold, in other words, if AOC, if Alexandra Cortez was the candidate for the Democrats, I think you would see a massive fall in Jewish support, right, for the Democrats. A woman who's not prepared to attend a memorial for former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, this would be a red flag for most American Jews, okay? But most American politicians, most of the time, make sure that they do enough to be seen as sufficiently pro-Israel to allow American Jews to vote on other issues. For those for whom Israel is most important, most of them would vote Republican, whatever. In other words, they identify as Republican, they don't swing between the parties, okay? This is very different from the 1948 election with Harry Truman, but this is the way it's been for a long time. Okay, so let's now do some speculation. So let's imagine what the implications of the presidential election could be if Trump wins or if Biden wins. So let's start with Trump. With Trump, the real question is, will it be the same? Will it be more of the same? So there are reasons to believe it will and reasons to believe it won't. So let's start with the reasons to believe it won't. The main reason that President Trump is pro-Israel is to do with domestic American politics. And that is that in order to win, he must get out his base, right? Those people who will support the Republicans come what may, because he's such a polarizing figure, he's not going to get the center. So he needs to get out his people. Now, if you're an evangelical Christian and personal morality is probably important to you, you're not going to vote for President Trump on the basis of his personal morality. So why might you vote for him? Two reasons. One is to do with Supreme Court appointments, right? If you have a conservative view on religion and state and other things, you might want to support President Trump. And the other is if Israel's important to you and he supports Israel. So one of the ways President Trump gets his people out and gets them to back him is by being pro-Israel. One of the reasons he gets money for his campaigns from people like Sheldon Adelson is because he's seen as pro-Israel. Now, all of that will be irrelevant because once the election's over, he can't run a third time. So that factor which pushes him to be pro-Israel will fall away. There are some others that will still be in place. And the main one is his family, right? Ivanka Trump's converted to Orthodox Judaism. She's married to Jared Kushner. They have a personal sympathy and connection with Israel. And that will remain. There are two other factors that we need to bring forward that will play more of a role because domestic politics will play less of a role. The first one is Trump's personality. Okay, we're talking about somebody who is extremely unpredictable and very narcissistic. In other words, he's very much affected by how people personally affect him, right? He takes it personally. So if you're nice to him and you butter him up, that makes a big difference. If not, it's very bad for you, okay? So that will come even more to the forward because it's not going to be constrained by thinking about what's going to happen the next time. The other issue, and this is really the one that's problematic for Israel, is what his strategic instincts are, his way of looking at the world in terms of foreign policy. Now, it's certainly true that he's very erratic and that, his personality is very dominant in the way he looks at things. But it's not true that he doesn't have a view of how America should behave in the world. He does. And it's part of a tradition, one that really hasn't been seen since before Pearl Harbor, but it existed and it was even quite important in the Republican Party between the wars. And that we can call belligerent minimalism. Belligerent in that he's really ready to use force. If you attack America or you attack Americans, he's going to blow you out the water, right? He's very ready to use force, no problem. But he's a minimalist, if not an isolationist, because he believes America should play less of a role in the world. Fortress America, America first. America first is the line used by isolationists. That was their calling card in the 1930s. And isolationists had two groups, one, hawkish Republicans, and two, dovish Democrats, okay? And they came together from different sides. And Trump is the first mainstream American politician in since Pearl Harbor to really represent that view. So he doesn't like America's commitment to allies. He doesn't like America being involved in the war, right? So when he met the North Korean leader, Kim, he offered to withdraw America's troops from South Korea. They've been there since 1953, since the end of the Korean War. There are 30,000 American troops there. And in general, Americans, strategists say, look, America protects the balance of power in the world. We need to keep them there. We need to constrain China. Trump's prepared to say, look, I can do a deal with you, and then we can go home. Now, that's been held in check because Trump's foreign policy advisors don't believe that. So John Bolton, when he was national security advisor, didn't believe it. And Mike Pompeo, doesn't believe it. They believe in American leaderships. They're assertive. They believe in using force if necessary, but they also believe in engaging, in being part of the world, in leading, in working with your allies, because if you work with your allies, you have more power, okay? Now, when America takes a step back in the world, whatever fills that vacuum is worse for Israel, yeah? So think of it like this. When Obama and Trump took a step back, each of them, in Syria, what came into that vacuum was Turkey, Russia, and Iran, okay? So that is the question mark. Now, some people say, including John Bolton, who was Trump's national security advisor, that there's a danger that Trump will do a bad deal with Iran after the election because what he really wants to do is get out of the Middle East. And he'll try and do what he tried to do with North Korea. I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely that there'll be even a minimal sort of meeting of minds. The Iranians will not be prepared to, to sort of make nice to Trump like the Chinese did and like the Koreans do, and give him a big cheering, crowds and delegation and honor. They won't do any of that. So I think that's unlikely. I think the real issue will be what happens when the maximum pressure strategy reaches its critical point. What do I mean by that? I mean that the Iranians are getting closer now to breakout, right? They were a year away and they're now a matter of months away. And it will come down to whether President Trump is prepared to threaten force or allow Israel to threaten force or to use force, or whether he's going to back away and do some kind of a deal that Israel doesn't think is a good one. It's that kind of crux situation which is very, very difficult to predict. If he were, I suspect the most likely thing would be that he would put it on Israel to go in and do it. But what you have to understand is that there is then a reasonably good likelihood of one of two things happening. Israel getting involved in a conflict, the likes of which we haven't seen, probably since the War of Independence in terms of damage to the home front, and possibly America getting dragged in. And so that could be very serious. That's Trump. Biden. So Biden is the last of the old school Cold War Democrats. That means that he came of age in a time where Americans believed they needed to lead the free world. And one of the differences between the way Obama talks and Biden talks is that Obama talks about something they called the international liberal order, by which they means there's certain rules, this is the way the world's run. And we hope that we can socialize countries like Russia and China to be good citizens by including them in all these institutions. Biden and Biden's people don't believe this, okay? They talk about the free world, as you did in the Cold War, when you have the West and the democracies here, and you have the Soviet Union and the authoritarian states there. So I think that whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden, we will see more pushback against China and Russia, particularly if it's Biden. It's probably going to be tougher on Russia, China, and Turkey than Trump. But as I said, it all depends whether it's Pompeo or Trump who would be making the policy. In the Gulf, I think we would see the process that we've seen over the last few months continue, since it actually, sorry about this, since it actually started under Obama. This has been going on since 2014. So I don't see any change in the direction. I don't think either of them will be as personally committed to it as Trump is now, because neither of them will have the same incentive. What might be positive if Biden wins is that Biden is much more likely to give the Saudis a tough time because of the Khashoggi affair, because of the murder by the regime in Saudi Arabia of a journalist, Saudi journalist. So they will need to give a democratic administration something. And one of the ways they might be able to give them something is actually on Israel, but who knows? Iran. This is going to be the most problematic element of US-Israeli relations with a Biden administration, because the Democrats already committed to re-entering the Iran deal. And whatever Israelis think about the way Netanyahu challenged the Iran deal, right? In other words, the way he did it, very few people in Israel think it was a good deal. It was just, how should we respond to America, as opposed to, do we think it's good or bad? So we know that Biden wants to lengthen the sunset clause. We know that he's reluctant to use force, and the Democrats will be more reluctant to use force. But there seems to be a debate among the people close to Biden between two groups on this. One is the minimalists, who are closer to the Obama view, and Biden's former national security advisor when he was vice president, Colin Kahl, he represents his view. He was like one of the brains behind the Iran deal. So I would expect him to be pushing for a return to something similar to what was before. On the other hand, you have more centrist people in the Democratic Party, like the likely Secretary of State for Defense, Michelle Flournoy. And she refused to join the Obama administration because she was much more hawkish on Syria and much more in favor of intervention. And these people are talking about putting broader pressure on Iran regionally. They were impressed and surprised by the success of America's unilateral sanctions, which they didn't think would work as well as they have. And they talk about the importance of expanding the deal to deal with missiles. You know, that fight between those two groups hasn't happened yet. So we don't know, you know, what the result will be, how it will play out. But I suspect we will see a policy that is not quite as accommodating as Obama's, and certainly not as confrontational as Trump's. It's clear that Israel can live much more easily with people like Michelle Flournoy than they can with people like Colin Kahl. So it will be important. What about what's Biden's personal record on Israel? And what about the Democrats in Israel? So look, Biden probably has the longest pro-Israel record of any Democrat engaged in politics. He goes back all the way to meeting Golda Meir around the time of the Yom Kippur War, when Stuart Eisenstadt's wife passed away. Stuart Eisenstadt was Carter's domestic policy advisor, a major figure in the American Jewish community. I happened to be in America then, and someone who was at the Shiva told me that Biden came, and when someone tried to speak to him about politics, he said, "I don't speak politics at a Shiva." So, but Biden has a very long relationship with the American Jewish community. He's got a very good record on supporting all the security stuff. Within the Obama administration, he was one of the people who was very much against not vetoing the UN resolution on settlements right at the end in 2016. I don't expect him to reverse Trump's position on Jerusalem. I don't expect him to allow the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to have much say on foreign policy. It's very noticeable that he allowed them into policy discussions on domestic politics, like economics and Supreme Court issues. He didn't let them in on foreign policy. And he is a centrist, and Democrats who define themselves as centrists are a lot more pro-Israel than Democrats who define themselves as liberals. Finally, what about the Democratic Party and trends in democratic support for Israel? Well, I actually have, I'm going to try and share something with you. Hang on, advanced share screen. Here we go. Share screen, okay. Okay, so the first thing to notice is there's a difference between how Democrats think about Israel and how Democrats think about the Israeli government and Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So here, this is Gallup, right? And they ask, do you have a favorable, unfavorable, or other attitude towards Israel and the Palestinian Authority? And what you see is 20 years, the Democrats have a favorable attitude to the state of Israel, and it's even a little bit higher than it was in the past. And it's double what it is for the Palestinian Authority. In other words, if you ask about the country, there's really no change, right? Israel is popular. It's more popular with the Republicans, right? The Republicans are up around 80, 90, and the Palestinian Authority is down about 6 or 7, right? But there seems to be no crisis, okay? If you ask, are you willing to send troops to help Israel if it's attacked by party? You'll see the Republicans is higher than the Democrats, right? Over the last 10 years, the Republicans is up around 70%. The Democrats is around 40, 45, and it's what it always has been. It's slightly higher than it was. So if we're talking about the underlying commitment, do you like Israel? Yes. Are you willing to help Israel if it's in trouble? Same as it was before. Okay, but if we start asking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then it looks different. So here you can see that Republicans' sympathy for Israel over the Palestinians has shot up in the last 20 years. And with Democrats, it went up for a decade between 2005 and 2014, and now it's gone down dramatically. And if we look at it for the Palestinians, right, it's gone up dramatically, yeah? Whereas for Republicans, it's flat. So, and when we combine the Israel and the Palestinians together, we get a massive pro-Israel margin among Republicans, and we see Democrats are almost even on Israel and the Palestinians. Okay. So this is about a number of things. I'm going to skip because I want to finish, and then you can ask me more questions if you like. Okay, I'm going to skip and I'm going to say, okay, here. Okay, this is sympathy for the Palestinians. I'm going to just make this a little bit smaller so that you can see. Hang on a minute. Okay, that's not it. Hang on. Okay, so this is sympathy for the Palestinians, okay? And you can see here you've got in dark blue liberal Democrats, then you have moderate Democrats, then you have moderate Republicans, and then you have conservative Republicans. And what you can see is that there's been a massive increase in sympathy for Palestinians among liberal Democrats. That's about half of Democrats, whereas moderate Democrats are more or less the same as moderate Republicans. Yeah, they sort of run in parallel. They obviously start in a different place, but that's the pattern. Okay, and if you look at sympathy for Israel, you see that it doesn't go by ideology, it goes by party, right? So moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans, yeah, their sympathy for Israel runs in parallel. And moderate Democrats and liberal Democrats, they fall in parallel. And the reason for this is because Israel has become connected up with partisan politics in America, right? In America, supporters of each party have never had more negative views of the other. And this makes them oppose things that they believe the other party support, irrespective of the merits, just because they hate the other team. And when Netanyahu went to Congress in 2015 to oppose the Iran deal, it wasn't his opposition that angered Democrats, because about a third of Democrats themselves didn't support the deal. It was the fact that the way that he did it, made it appear, and this pretty much was the case, that he was siding with the Republicans, that he was taking the Republican side. So since then, what we see is that although moderate Democrats are more pro-Israel than liberal Democrats, the fall in Netanyahu's personal standing with Democrats mirrors the fall in sympathy for Israel. And this fall is the same, for whether you're a moderate Democrat or a liberal Democrat, okay? So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because although Biden is a centrist Democrat, right? We're not likely to see, because of that he would have a problem with the commitment to Israel, to Israeli security. He's not going to have a problem with the commitment to Israeli security. He's not going to have a problem with, the Kishkas thing about feeling sympathetic to Israel. He has a favorable view. So do most of the Democratic Party. He is going to have a problem with Netanyahu, okay? And he is going to have a problem if Netanyahu's strategy is a Republican first strategy, okay? So I've spoken for the allotted maximum time given to me by Paul. So I know I haven't totally closed this down, but I'm gonna hand back to Paul for questions and answers. Anyone who's interested in those things can ask me about them. So thank you very much for your patience, and back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Can you turn off the slides and so we can see your face again? Great, wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. That was a fantastically concise account. There's a number of questions on a range of issues. I want to ask. I'm going to sort of try and group some of the similar questions together. There were quite a few questions relating to the possibility / probability, depending on who's asking, that Biden's health as an older man, who some say is showing signs of his age in his public speaking and other things, that he won't actually make it through the first term, and that he'll be replaced by Kamala Harris. And therefore, we should also be asking the question, what would President Kamala Harris mean for Israel? Can you answer that, and maybe also touch on the related question, which is the extent to which Biden, you kind of already answered, but because people pushed it, I'm going to ask again, the extent to which Biden will be, to some extent, influenced by the left of the party, the more hostile to Israel side of the party.
Yeah. Okay. So first, look, Biden, if he wins, will be the oldest president in America. So it's clear that his age is an issue. I think it will be hard to say that he is as dynamic as he was 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, certainly I heard him when he was here, I think it was 2011 or something like that. And he is a very dynamic speaker. He's obviously not as, as he was, but he's always been a bit of a foot in mouth politician. He's always sort of said the old thing that doesn't make any sense. I can't bear to watch the debates from start to finish, but from what I have seen, he's compos mentis. I mean, he's there. So I don't think he's deteriorated beyond the point at which he can't be, can't really run. He seems, okay. I mean, it's I think that there's one could certainly talk about how a country of over 300 million can produce just these two candidates, but that's a separate issue. Kamala Harris, look, we don't know a lot about her view of foreign policy, because she was a prosecutor in California. We know she's married to someone Jewish. We know that, she goes to AIPAC. She's not one of these people who, skips AIPAC and only goes to J Street. I would say that being a prosecutor is probably a good thing, but this is just I don't have evidence. It's just thinking it through logically, is that, someone who goes after the bad guys, that's good when you have to deal with the Middle East. It's good to have that kind of mentality. She certainly seems a very competent woman, but, we don't know. We simply don't know what it would be like. It would not be disastrous, that's for sure, in terms of, she's not going to hate Israel or anything like that. How she will manage American foreign policy, it's very, very difficult to know, because she hasn't said a lot about it. We know that she's not part of the sort of far left sort of side of the Democratic, foreign policy people, all of that. But beyond that, we don't really know. Why do I think that the left of the party won't have much influence? Because Biden won't let them have. And it's as simple as that. The American system is such that the president decides everything, right? It's not a parliamentary system like Britain or like Israel. And, he's not even let them in the consultations. I mean, they won't have anyone. They don't like the people around him on foreign policy, but they've been told to put up or shut up, because he's going to give them influence on domestic stuff. And that, one of the interesting things is that when you look at those who are more left-wing in the Democratic Party, their priorities are primarily domestic. When you ask them, when you ask Democrats, who should we side with in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the majority say America should be even-handed, right? Of those that remain, doubles say they should be sympathetic to Israel, lean more towards Israel rather than with the Palestinians, which means that there's a lot of progressives who make up half the Democratic Party, not progressives, liberals make up half the Democrat. There's a lot of them for whom this is not an important issue, right? So they may mouth off, but it's not going to be worth it for them. They've got other things, other fish to fry, unless Israel pokes them in the eye, right? And then makes it, a big issue. If Israel was to suddenly annex half the West Bank tomorrow, you can bet it would be an issue. But if you're not going to do that, then they got other things that are more important to them. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict doesn't register in the top 20 issues for Democrats. It just doesn't register for them. So, noise is one thing, but policy is another. So I don't, unless Israel does something to poke them in the eye, I don't think that they're going to have a lot of influence.
Great, thank you very much. You touched just there at the end on the issue of Israeli policy towards the Palestinians in the West Bank. There were a few questions regarding that, and specifically, what might a Biden administration do? What might Biden's administration do or think regarding the idea of Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank, and B, this kind of new paradigm of Israel signing normalization / peace agreements with the Arab states, even in the absence of movement on the Palestinian issue, this kind of move away from the idea that it's the Palestinians first.
Yeah, so following the debate among Democrats since 2014, not even 2016, they are not going to want to burn a lot of serious energy on something that will probably produce nothing. That's how they look at the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. In other words, Obama, after 1 year in office, was asked, what have you learned? What's your lesson that you've learned? And he said, I learned that it's much harder to make Israeli-Palestinian peace than I thought. And Kerry said, no, I can do it. She said, all right, you try. I'm not going to stop you. I'll be there if you need me. Obviously, you know the rest. So, and that's Obama, right? So if you're an American politician, you only have a certain amount of time if you're president. You've got to deal with 1,000,001 foreign policy things, 1,000,001 domestic things. You're not going to waste a lot of time on this issue unless, and here's the thing, unless two things, it gets particularly bad or it gets particularly good. If they think there's a real chance of an agreement, then they'll want to get involved. If they think that Israel's going to try and apply sovereignty to the West Bank, then they're going to get involved because they're going to be against it. I think their watchword will be, we don't want the situation to develop in a way which precludes at some future point a peace deal based on a two-state solution. And we would like to help in any way that we can move forward peace, whether it's Israel and the Gulf states, Israel and the Palestinians. I think ideally, they would like to use the regional framework. They'd like to use the Gulf states to nudge the Palestinians to be more, to engage in talks. But, they're not gonna, if the Palestinians don't do it, they don't do it. The Americans might, send an envoy and go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. But they're not gonna apply any serious pressure unless Israel decides to take a step which they think, right, damages the prospects for a future two-state solution, which would be some kind of application of sovereignty or some kind of major expansion of settlements. If it's settlements here and there, then you'll get the usual denunciations and slaps on the wrist and lots of noise, but no substance. I think that the much more serious issues are actually security related. And I would say that in Syria, they're likely to be closer in the way they look at it than Trump and Israel. But on Iran, it's going to be a problem.
Okay. So there were a few questions that were sort of not so much about the US-Israel relationship and more relating to your comments about the election itself. One is, I'll ask a couple. Is it true, someone said that they read that 70 million Americans have already voted? And if that's true, okay.
Yeah.
And also, is it the case that 40% of Americans have been disenfranchised?
No. What I said was, there's been a 40% increase,
right?
Yeah, in the number of Americans, who have been deregistered, if you like, from being able to vote, and that's one element. And the other element is that if you turn up with your ID and say it's folded or it's got a crinkle or it's got the apostrophe in the wrong place, then there are attempts to then nullify your ballot, right? To say that's what's going on. Or that in certain areas, I can't say I know this myself, but there's research that suggests that in areas with a heavy Black concentration where they vote Democrat, the queues are twice as long, right? So we're talking about that kind of thing, okay? So it's, we won't know until afterwards, right? Exactly to what extent that kind of thing will play, but it's a factor, and it's a factor in a way that it wasn't right before because it was illegal to do those kind of things, and also you didn't have the computing power to even attempt it, which now you do have.
The person who asked that question, by the way, also wanted to know, and I think you've answered or at least hinted at it, but which way are the people who are likely to be disenfranchised going to vote? Is the implication?
Yeah, it's the Democrats. The Democrats are losing out. So there were, if you look at some of the midterms from 2018, some of the Senate races and House races, then you can see that the gap between the Republican and the Democrat candidate was smaller than the number of the electors who in the previous 2 years had been deregistered. And when President Trump had a commission into voter fraud, he shut it down himself after half a year because there wasn't the evidence to say that this was a massive problem. So you know, that's why I'm saying that even if Biden is ahead, according to the polls, then it might, you know, it can still go another way, right? They may take a bunch of postal votes, and they may, you know, say there's this technically wrong with it and that technically wrong with it, and then it will go to court, and then it will get dragged out, and then it will be very controversial. You know, that's what I'm talking about. I have no idea how it will exactly turn out. What I'm saying is that these things are in play, and in the past they weren't in play. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. There was a question about Congress and about Democrats in Congress, and the fact that, as the questioner asks, or makes the point that most Democratic members of Congress have pro-Israel records. They overwhelmingly voted against BDS, but you do have the usual suspects, the kind of newer, more progressive, more hostile to Israel members of Congress. Do you think that they could, that group, that progressive group, their numbers could grow, or there could be a change even in the more pro-Israel members could change their views due to sort of the activist class of the Democratic Party?
So this is the question. That's a great question. This is really the question. Now, if we look at the Democrats when Al Gore ran in 2000, okay, half of Democrats considered themselves moderate ideologically, and there were only slightly more liberal Democrats than conservative Democrats. In other words, the Democrats were a rainbow party, they ideologically, right? And in terms of race, but ideologically, yeah, they had conservatives, they had liberals, and they had a lot of moderates in the middle, okay? Today, half of Democrats identify as liberal, a third or more identify as moderate, and about 10 to 13% identify as conservative. That's a big change. Now, part of that is because America's more liberal, right? So there are now, say, 28% liberal people in America compared to 18, 19, 20 years ago. Conservatives are still more, they're around 35, 36%, but the number of moderates has fallen, right? So the Democrats, younger people are more liberal generationally, yeah? And they're more and more identified with the Democrats. So there is a challenge because liberals, yeah, are less pro-Israel than moderates, who are less pro-Israel than conservatives. But, and this is important for anyone sitting in Europe, in 2008, Pew, which is the best pollster probably in the world, right? And it was certainly in America, did a survey. And in both the major European democracies and in America, conservatives are the most pro-Israel, then moderates, and then liberals. But an American liberal was more sympathetic to Israel than a European conservative, right? For reasons that I can't go into now, you can read my book if you want to know, American political culture is much more pro-Israel than European political culture, okay? So there's a real difference. That's number one. Number two, among progressive Democrats, we use the word progressive to signify sort of more left-wing, right? And liberal as sort of a broader church, yeah? A lot of them care about foreign aid. Now, foreign aid is very, very unpopular with the American voter, right? Israel gets the biggest chunk of foreign aid, and then comes Egypt, which is connected to Israel, right? Because Egypt only gets it because it's got peace with Israel. So Israel gets, I think, 3.8 billion a year. Egypt gets 2 point something billion. And that's the vast majority of the aid budget. But if you're progressive, you care about aid to Africa and all the rest of it. Now, the way that the aid budget goes through Congress is in one lump, right? So there are quite a few progressive Democrats who, whatever they think about Israel, just stay out of it. And the reason they stay out of it is because they need Israel to get that aid. Otherwise, there's a good chance that America's aid budget will get decimated and their favorite projects will get decimated. So they have their own reasons for perhaps not being as an assertive on the money, right, as opposed to the rhetoric, yeah, because they need it. And that's why the Republicans wanted to separate the Israel budget from the general budget, yeah, so that they can destroy that kind of thing that helps the Democrats remain more pro-Israel so that they can be, you know, the pro-Israel party. The final thing is you have to make a distinction between two things in the Democratic Party. And so I tried to do before. Those who are, you know, in the anti-Israel camp, of whom there aren't that many, right? We saw that more than 2-1, the Democrats prefer Israel to the Palestinian Authority, right? And 75% of Democrats think Israel's an important economic and strategic ally for the US. Most of the arguments with Israel with the Democrats is simply this, that Democrats are more dovish than Israelis and than Republicans, right? So they differ on policy. And just like Israelis shout at each other all the time about what Israel should be doing, sort of Americans are like our cousins. They sit around the table and argue as well, and they get heated because actually they're more engaged with Israel than Europeans. They're more emotionally engaged, more emotionally involved. So they get, you know, think about it this way. If you care about Israel, you don't like the policy, you get upset and you get angry. That's most Democrats, right? So they are angry over the policies because they disagree with the policies. They don't have hostility to Israel. There is that minority that does, okay? And the danger is that the other half, the one that's sympathetic to Israel in a general sense, but is hostile to the sense that Israel has, that Netanyahu is like too close with Trump, too close with the Republicans. We have a narrow right-wing government, so they don't like that policy. The danger is that at the moment that's fluid. So if we had a different leader, it'd probably go back to what it was before, right? But the danger is that that cake becomes baked and then you can't unbake it, it hardens. We're not there yet, but that is something that could happen. And so that's why the question that was asked is the question, right, over the long term.
Okay. We've reached the hour mark, but there's a couple more questions that I want to ask, if that's okay with you. Sure. There was a question about whether the result of the election will impact the likelihood of an election here. Maybe you could give us your take on that and maybe just broaden it out to what the election would mean maybe for Israeli politics. We can assume, I think, based on what you said and also what I think we can see with our own eyes, that Netanyahu would have a clear preference. Whether that's shared by others, you can also opine on as you wish.
Yeah, so look, Lapid has put forward a no confidence motion because we don't have a budget. And Gantz is upset because he wants that vote to happen after the election, not before the election. He wants to know the result of the American election beforehand. And that tells you everything you need to know. If Trump wins clearly, then Netanyahu, that helps him domestically a lot. Yeah. And so that means he'll decide, you know, based on what he thinks his chances are, whether he goes to an election or not. He will look at the polls. He'll know that he'll get a sort of boost because Trump will say lots of nice things. However, if Biden wins, then I think it's going to be Gantz who thinks that an election might be worthwhile because it will put Netanyahu in a place that he might not want to be. And that is, it's hard for him to satisfy his base, which is right-wing Israel, right? And a democratic administration, okay? One of them is going to be upset. So either he's going to upset Biden, and then that reflects to the centrist Israeli who says, our relationship with the US is very important. Why are you pleasing the Israeli right when you should be working with the US? Or then he could upset his right-wing base, who then say, well, maybe we should vote for Naftali Bennett. You know, his support's rising because there's a sense that Netanyahu hasn't handled COVID as well as he should have, and Bennett's ideas are seen as having been, better, and there's a lot of anger at a sense that maybe the ultra-Orthodox are not playing by the rules because Netanyahu doesn't want to annoy them because he needs them for his government. So yes, it could generate a dynamic that will either push either side towards an election. Both of them, Netanyahu wants an election because he doesn't want to hand over to Gantz next November, because he thinks that if that happens, his chances of ending up in prison will grow exponentially because he won't be able to block the court case. And Gantz, having come round to the view that that's Netanyahu's view, will look for any opportunity to go to the electorate on favorable terms, okay, which he doesn't have right now, okay, which he certainly doesn't have right now.
Brilliant. Okay, so a last question. I'm going to sort of try and throw in a couple of things that have come up in one last question, which is about going back to America. And there was a question about what would happen in America if Trump loses, and particularly when there's sort of talk of not just legal challenges but violence. There was another question about sort of radical groups that have sort of supported Trump, radical sort of far right groups that have supported Trump, and on the other side there was a question about sort of left-wing anti-Semitism and the role of and the fact that, you know, the anti-Israel wing of the Democratic Party, even if, as you say, it's a small number of people, often that manifests itself or as a guise for anti-Semitism. What do you have to say about that sort of whole debate, which is kind of blowing up in American Jewry about anti-Semitism coming from left and right, and perhaps left-wing Jews only criticizing right-wing anti-Semitism and right-wing Jews only criticizing left-wing anti-Semitism? Can you just finish with your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a believer in the horseshoe view of politics. What's the horseshoe view of politics? That right and left are not a continuum from here to here. We have a horseshoe. The far right and the far left are actually much closer together, right, than the rest, the center, which is out there. There's anti-Semitism on the far right. There's anti-Semitism on the far left. You know, I don't want to get into a competition, right? You know, each has their own pathologies. One is probably bigger than the other, but the other, that is the right. But the left is much harder to tackle because they don't profess to be anti-Semitic. So they profess to stand for things like human rights. So they may be smaller, but they are more difficult to challenge. Even among those who are, you know, not sympathetic to Israel in the Democratic Party, the amount that are actually anti-Semitic is really much smaller. But this is the thing: if the election result is unclear, every single extremist from San Diego to Maine will see it as an opportunity to cause trouble, and they'll be out on the streets trying to cause trouble, trying to fan the flames, to have violence, whether it's on the left, far left, or the far right. You know, really, it comes down to the fact that ultimately the vast majority of Americans will have to stand up and be counted. And we are talking about the vast majority of Americans, right, who don't want to start shooting and blowing people up. So it looks like there is a very high chance that there will be violence and it will get nasty. But, you know, hopefully there will be the right leadership, and that will end, you know, in a reasonable and good way. I do not think it will descend into absolute chaos and civil war. I really don't. But I also think it won't be pleasant.
Okay, that's a hopeful / realistic ending to what's been a marvelous presentation and lecture. Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan Reinhold. I think we've all learned something, and we're 6 days away from the big event itself. I want to take this opportunity also to publicize some courses that we're doing here at the Begin Center. I've just sent into the chat box a link to the catalog and a link to register. Most of those courses are in Hebrew, but 2 of them are in English, and they look, to my eyes at least, really fantastic courses. One on Zionism, one on sort of national security issues in the world today, which we're doing in conjunction with the Institute for National Security Studies, which is a leading think tank here in Israel. So by all means, check those out. I want to thank everyone for attending. We'll be back next week. It will be the day after the election, and we will be doing nothing about America. We will be providing you with an escape from whatever chaos is going on in the media following the election. So look out for details of that on our website and our Facebook page. And you can email me if you're not on my mailing list. You can join my mailing list by emailing me, Paul G, Paulg, at begincenter.org.il. That's center spelt the American way, CENTER. And thank you, everyone. Thanks again to Jonathan Reinhold, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you all very much. Good evening.